Hello, welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about an ancient system of personality archetypes called Enneagrams. It's a return visit for our guest, Helen Palmer, a faculty member at JFK University, a practicing clairvoyant, and she directs the Center for the Investigation and Training of Intuition. An Enneagram. What is that?
It simply means 9 points in Greek. These are identified as 9 distinct personality types that were located in an ancient Sufi system. This is a Sufi system that we're talking about. And interestingly enough, these 9 types that were identified a long time ago map in a one-to-one relationship with the major diagnostic categories of modern psychotherapy.
Let's put them in time and space. Who are the Sufis, and what is their system that this is a part of?
Well, you could look at the Sufis as kind of the mystical wing of Islam. It's like every major religion has a mystical component to it, a group of people who believe in direct experience of God in the sense of a higher power. And the mystics are committed to the development of what are called higher human states, or those states of mind where you can have access to what look like, superficially, kind of divine attributes like clairvoyance and precognition and those kinds of abilities which are really available to humans and which have a methodology and a whole history behind them, a whole history of study. So the Sufis were simply that group of people who were attached to the Islamic religion that believed in this direct experience. And they used the Enneagram, allegedly, although it's very hard to prove this because we're dealing with an oral tradition that covers its tracks in the sands of time, literally in the desert, where these Sufi houses were alleged to have their operation. So we don't know very much about them directly, but we do know certain Westerners who, again, allegedly have visited these houses and been trained. And the person that we got the Enneagram from was Gurdjieff, who was a Russian who was very active in the upper class of Europe during the Second World War. And he had access to this very powerful 9-point personality system called the Enneagram, which he described but never gave. He described it as the tool that he used to assess the psychological qualities in his students so that he could train them for higher states of consciousness. So, of course, we all got fascinated with such a statement that somehow the personality could be used as a launching pad to get into these higher states of mind. In psychotherapy at that time, during the last generation, we thought of the personality as sort of, or the neurotic personality as being aberrant, or something to heal and get rid of so that we could adjust back to the normal run of society. This point of view of how to work with the so-called neurosis or the personality is very different. You take the preoccupations of the neurosis and see them in a positive light, that one can use them to apply practices to alleviate the neurosis, and by applying the practices, one moves into another state of mind. So it has a kind of a different flavor than ordinary psychotherapy.
Is there a progression in this system? We say everybody's different. No two human beings ever were exactly the same, and yet you're boiling them down to 9 basic personality,
yes,
character types.
You know, that's a question that often comes up because almost in reaction to psychotherapy, or psychoanalysis, I should say, we're in this time of our development, we're very anti-reductionist. We don't want to put anybody in a category, and everybody's free. And I have to say, Charlie, you know, that in the way that I learned this, it was one of the great and humbling ideas behind this is to eliminate the idea of personal choice, to eliminate the idea of freedom of choice. And this system of personality, and I think there's a flavor behind most psychotherapy, that we are very limited in our freedom of choice. Our degrees of freedom are enormously limited by our preoccupations. And those preoccupations, they operate almost as a set of blinders, you know. What we're focused on, what our attention is preoccupied with, it stands out in our visibility as if that's the full range of what is being presented to us. We never see 360 degrees, just if you follow this system, you see 1/9. You see one of 9 possible slices of the 360 degree cake. But again, we have this idea, particularly in the West, that we're enormously free. And according to these ideas of the human mind, we're very limited. What we have is freedom in the sense of being able to choose what kind of dress you wear in the morning or what movie you're going to go to. In that sense, you have unlimited choice. But in a real sense, like being able to choose to enter other states of mind or to see things as they really are rather than a biased view limited by the personality preoccupations, we don't have that freedom. And so that's kind of taken for granted in a system like this.
Is there a progression within the system so you can move from a 2 to a 2.5 to a 3 and actually change your personality traits?
Well, it's not a reductionist system in the sense that you are limited completely to one of the 9 types. For example, I'll speak from my own type because somehow by full self-disclosure, it seems like less of a limitation to somebody listening if I limit myself.
Okay.
But my own personality type is a paranoid type in modern language, and in the ancient systems would be called ego coward. And the interesting thing about the paranoid, or in this system, the cowardly type, is it doesn't look cowardly at all on the outside. You see, for example, for me to take a position on mysticism in an academic community is not the typical idea of a coward's approach. So already you have the flavor of what the Enneagram is. Things are not as they seem. The designation is not pejorative or limited into a small category in the sense that one operates kind of like a knee-jerk reflex, always the same. But it's a very full definition of what the human consciousness is about. There is a movement within the Enneagram in answer to your question. In other words, we are not limited to a particular fixation. In the heart points, in other words, when we are in a situation that is not stressful, the attention moves to another set of preoccupations, those that exist at the points of the heart. There is a movement towards stress. In other words, when you take on a task or you set up a stressful situation for yourself, as you go toward it, the set of preoccupations changes to the point of stress. The thing about the glyph, or the diagram of the Enneagram, that's so powerful to me, is that within these 9 types, and their interrelationships as you move from heart to point to stress and back again, there is an enormous kind of funneling from one major diagnostic category to another, so that you can watch your set of preoccupations change as your external conditions change. So no, you're not limited, but yes, you are limited in the sense that we have this illusion, I think, in America, and that we have unlimited choice.
Are you a number 2 type personality in non-stress situations and a number 7 in stress situations? Do you have more than one point on this 9-point system?
You move to a different point in a stress situation and to a different point in a very comfortable situation.
What number is this that we're dealing with you?
Well, it's not better or worse, like there are 9 points. It's not like 9 is higher than 1 or 7 is not so good as 2. It doesn't work like that. But the ego coward is 0.6 on the Enneagram. And for example, in my own life, my own tendency to be afraid and to confront my fear by going into it, which is the coward's approach, in a heart situation or when I am relaxed, I become more indolent. I would go to the 9 point. I would become much more likely to putz around the house, trivialize, get out the chicken soup pot, feed the neighbors. It has a much more indolent quality than my point of paranoia. But the point is the reference. That's the reference point that developed in early childhood. And just to finish off this little diagram, in a stress situation, I would go into what is called ego vanity, or the workaholic personality, where attention focuses on the performance and the job to be done and is systematically withdrawn from personal feelings. So there's no chicken soup pot and there's no neighbors. It's just an awful lot of drive to get the story out correctly. And that's my central focal point. So do you see, under this is really a question of where does attention locate itself? And this is the issue in mysticism, which is very different than psychotherapy. What happens to attention as it moves through various situations? Because by locating attention and what it is preoccupied with, you have a starting point to be able to shift attention. And all we are trying to do is to learn how to master attention in the inner life. For most people, the idea of thought or shifting one's thought or actually moving attention into a whole different set of preoccupations, it's a very alien concept. In mysticism, it's imperative that you learn how to shift attention from thought to other thoughts and eventually to non-thinking states. And the quest of mysticism is, what is the information in the non-thinking state? You see, so this is what we're really after, is to just use the neurosis and the preoccupations and whether or not you're addicted to indolence and the chicken soup pot, or workaholism and the performance, or whether you're afraid or not afraid. It's almost irrelevant in one sense. But in another sense, it's very vital, because you have to have a starting point of one's personal preoccupations in order to be able to study attention. And in mysticism, attention is the underlined word. How can we move attention into a non-thinking state? First, we have to know what we are thinking, to have a comparison.
With a system that has tracks buried in sand, it's difficult to know for sure. Mm-hmm. But what is your opinion of how the Sufis came up with the classification of the various personality types? How did they get, first of all, the number 9 as a basis, and how did they determine whether the chicken soup should go in number 7 or in number 2?
Well, they'd operate the same way that any human being operates. I mean, we can take our own experience with the Enneagram. At first it came through Gurdjieff, who didn't even say what it was, he just alluded to it. And then it came into the hands of another Sufi teacher, allegedly from these same covered with tracks teaching houses, named Oscar Chazo, who gave the message that the material should now be elucidated. It should be given out and described. So Oscar gave the material, and who came to it, to his original training, but several people from Esalen, Claudio Naranjo, Joseph Hart, John Lilly, were 3 of the men that were involved in the growth movement. We're talking now about 1970. So the material was given in a very brief form. It was given almost in allegorical form. For example, the indolent type who trivializes. Now, you can't make much of that, really, you see. But when you start using it as an inspection device, then the whole world and dilemma of the obsessional character and all of the issues attached to that, the preoccupational issues attached to that, fall into a certain perspective. So these people then added what they had learned from psychological framework onto the Enneagram. So I'm sure it went from person to person to person. For example, when I first learned it, it was taught as an esoteric psychological system. And it's a very powerful one, better than anything that I ever got in graduate school. It's tighter. It gives prediction as to how someone will operate in stress and heart. It gives a kind of predictability that you don't find in most psychological theories. So I was very impressed with it. But then I had to bend it to my own interests, which is the study of intuition and the study of attention. So I will add my little piece, and the next little Sufi down the line will add his or her piece. So in a sense, Sufism operates as a kind of working of the material, which you then pass on. And somebody takes it and passes it on further.
Does that make it a living system?
It makes it an oral tradition system where it goes from teacher to student to teacher to student, you see. And this is how it's been preserved for all of this time. But it passes into different vocabularies or different language systems depending on who's working with it. And I think this is how it happened in the old traditions, that it was observed as 9 prototypes, a very close observational system of human personality. And then it was worked through different combinations depending on what people needed from it, very much as we're working it.
Where does the number 9 come from? How did we happen onto 9 basic types?
Well, there is a mathematical derivation, which is a mystical derivation. I don't know if you're interested in it. But, in fact, I'd rather not go into it because it would take me 15 minutes to do the mathematical derivation. I will refer you to someone. John Bennett, who was a major student of Gurdjieff, has a book on the Enneagram giving the mathematical derivation. He put tremendous weight on this. You see, that it came from an esoteric mathematical system. In fact, I'm not terribly interested in that. It satisfies me that this system is a kind of self-fulfilling or a self-perpetuating system, that I can use it in working with people and I can see its operation.
One of your specific interests is intuition.
Yeah.
How does this system apply in your attempt to help people learn to train their intuitive ability?
Well, this moves away from the Enneagram and toward my interest in intuition. But when I first began to recognize that I had some intuitive capacities myself, I noticed that it was at the time when my attention was heightened through my habit of fear. So I first began to realize, I always knew I was a paranoid type, but here I had a whole system with 8 other types of people attached to it who had very different emotional and preoccupational systems. So by studying my own, I could see that in these heightened moments when my fear was on me, my attention got very narrow and very sharp. Unfortunately for me, and unfortunately for all of us, the attention is highly habituated to be narrowed on a set of very small preoccupations. In my early childhood, I was very concerned about violence. This was presented to me as an issue in my family, alcoholic violence. So my short-term precognition as to what my parents would be doing, often before they knew themselves, would they be embarrassing or potentially harmful, became very, very tight, you see. But it was narrowed to this unfortunate, small situation of personal survival.
Mm-hmm. You didn't have any intuition about the stock market or who was going to win the baseball game?
No, I just wanted to get out of the way.
Uh-huh.
I wanted a safe exit for embarrassing situations. That was my entire intuition was located, I might say, on that narrow range of abilities. So when I started to apply spiritual practices, when I was an adult with my habits already formed, and I began to have direct psychic experiences as a side effect of these practices, I realized that the state of mind in which I received impressions, accurate impressions from situations that were unknown to my thoughts, that the same state of mind had operated all through my life in this very small protective slot, this habit slot. So when I first learned the Enneagram, I was fascinated with the idea that there are 8 other styles of preoccupation, and that when attention is moved with great focus toward these preoccupational childhood survival issues, that those people are likely to be sensitive and quite psychic about certain other issues other than short-term precognition about outrageous parents. Do you see? So in this way, the Enneagram has served my purposes because it gives 9 wonderful paradigms of attentional preoccupations.
And you take students through each of them until you hit on the magic one for each individual student?
Well, it's taught, the Enneagram is taught in an oral tradition fashion, which means that I would, in this case, or the Enneagram teacher, would work for one evening, a solid evening, with a panel of exemplars, 6 or 7 people, who are identified as clear types of one of the points. So if it were my night, I would be interviewing 6 paranoid types. Now, obviously, these are normal neurotic people. They're not flaming paranoids.
Sounds like a good time.
But you interview them as to their behaviors and how they've operated in their life, the decisions they came to, what makes them run,
mm-hmm.
and what their emotional state is. And everything depends in oral tradition work on the integrity and the willingness of the source, which are these people who are willing to describe themselves. Oral means exactly that it's passed by word of mouth. And if you have somebody who is going to defend or going to be, somehow not willing to present themselves in a clear way, for whatever reason, then you don't have a very clear panel of exemplars from which other people can identify themselves. So by seeing the 9 types for one evening a week, it's unusual that somebody cannot identify themselves. And if they can't, well, then you'd work further to draw them out as to what they really were intending, or what their behavioral, what their decisions really have been in life. Because some people are not used to observing themselves. They're really not. But if you have, a minimal of self-observation ability, you know how you think, you can witness your own thoughts to some degree, you'd be unlikely not to recognize yourself as one of the 9.
It would take too much time to go through all of the 9 types and all of the specific characteristics, but can you give us some kind of a feel of a basic roadmap to an Enneagram?
Well, you might take the 3 classical falls, which in this system, again a mystical system, the 3 falls from childhood, where a child can see things as they are without bias or distortion. Again, that's an inherently unprovable assumption, but we all assume it, that somehow the child has a willingness to perceive that once conditions have taken over, they are unable to perceive in that clear way again. So there are 3 classical types. One is the child who fell into family conditions that essentially put them to sleep. Their only sin was that they fell asleep at the wheel. So the child was overlooked, and the child became deaf to the essential self, the real self, and became preoccupied with trivia and small things, so that the real self got buried. I think this would be the kind of person who, as an adult, might be cooking a meal for someone coming for noon lunch, and they start to chop the carrots. And as they're chopping, all of a sudden, well, the laundry has to be done. And then so we move to do a little bit of laundry. And then after the laundry has been picked up and put in the washing machine and the thing is churning around, Well, what we notice is that the windowsill needs to be dusted right behind the washing machine, and so we move into the dusting. You can imagine running a corporation like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So after the dusting, it's getting to be very close to 12 o'clock, and then we get very rushed. But in the meantime, we have to move the clothes from to the dryer from the washer. So people arrive, and nothing has been done. You see, it's been a substitution of the task by trivia. Do you see?
Mm-hmm. We've had lunch there.
You've had lunch.
Joan Margalith and I have both had lunch there a couple of times.
Well, it's a substitution of it's a substitution of trivia for the focus on the task,
Okay.
which you can see would be a wonderful arena for somebody who needs to focus on the task. So we can apply focusing techniques, meditational techniques to keep the attention steady.
Okay.
So the neurosis is really a friend in disguise. All right, the other two of the classical falls from grace, one is the fall into the illusion of the world. The individual who became addicted to image, the projection of image. And this is called ego vanity. And it doesn't mean vain of the self. It means vain of product and performance. This is the child who was rewarded for achievement and performance rather than for real self. This is the child who wasn't asked, what are you feeling and how did you get on and what was your emotional life? It was like, how many grades did you get that were high?
Mm-hmm. $1 for an A.
$1 for an A. And so we come into adult life looking for $1 for an A, so that the societal values become very important because they can reward the self, except the self isn't really questioning what it wants. You see, it kind of sold itself out.
Okay.
This would be America really is an ego vanity society, where image has replaced essential feelings. The third classical fall would be the fall into fear, and I've described that loosely as my own character type, where childhood conditions fell into fear. The other 6 of the types are variations of those 3 falls. 3 falls that fell into sleep, 3 falls that fell into image, 3 falls that fell into fear. For example, variations of the image type. One is called the depressed type, ego melancholy, where the real self was retracted and feelings, exaggerated feelings, were substituted for the real self. It's the manic depressive type. It's a compensation for real feelings by overamping and exaggerating feelings so that they become almost imaginative. Another variation of ego vanity, the third variation, would be what is called ego flattery, the hysterical type, where feelings are produced by association with other people. It's a highly empathic point. One takes identity from other people. It's almost like being able to shift into being something of value to many different people, almost like a chameleon. You see, where the real self can get lost and buried by a substitution of the feelings of other people.
And to recap again, the purpose of understanding this system in a very general sense is that once you have identified these character types, then you are able to work through that character type to help an individual focus so that they can go above and beyond in their personal development.
Well, my interest is not in particularly in adjusting them into life. I think that's a therapeutic task, but it's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested much more in using the mental preoccupations. First of all, that a person can self-observe and know when they are preoccupied with those issues. Secondly, that they can apply attentional practices to shift their attention away from those preoccupations. In learning how to shift attention, one can open up a recognition of these interior states of mind. You see, all we need to do is to learn how to shift attention into a non-thinking or another state of mind away from preoccupations. And then these interior abilities start to reveal themselves. They're already there, but we're so focused on our piece of the goods, our 1/9 of the cake, you see, that we really don't ever shift attention away from that. You see, and this is what I mean by the limitation of freedom. Our attention's very focused on these issues.
This is Infinity on K. Do you have a feeling, an intuitive feeling about where I might fit in this 9-point system?
The way that I was taught this, that's a terrible question. It's a real faux pas. The idea in this tradition is never to lay a trip on someone. Like if somebody walked in and said, well, Helen, you're a flaming paranoid, I wouldn't take it lightly. So, one of the great abuses, I think, of the system, and I'm not trying to evade you, Charlie, but one of the great abuses is because it's a hot system, you recognize your friends and relations, you recognize your family within it. The tendency is to label other people. Do you see? And I think this was your original question, that people don't like to be categorized and labeled, even though they know they fall into a category. They don't want somebody else sticking it on them. So I'll pass, Charlie.
Okay, here comes another 7 or 8 or 9. It's fascinating to me, the relationship between current psychotherapeutic language and the whole approach that we have today, the correlation with a system that's 1,500 or so odd years old.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say about human evolution?
Well, in my opinion, we've come back to trying to study the ways in which our unconscious has intervened and taken us away from clear perception. And the only reason that we're interested in seeing things as they are, truly, without these biases, is because we need that so badly. We need to know what's going on in another of the 8 types. We need to understand what's going on inside of someone else because we're so up against egoism and personal power. There was a time in the 60s, where the me generation became a really forefront topic in California pop psychology. And I think we're moving away from that now because by understanding the self at depth, we have to understand somehow that we are connected to other people. So the scene has shifted into understanding what someone else is like, not through our ideas, but through a direct experience, like a clairvoyant or a clairsentient experience, which is to be able to focus on another person as they are to themselves in a non-thinking state, rather than trying to psychologically identify what it might be like to stand in their shoes. Okay, so there's a big difference between psychological understanding, like I understand your category and how you think. You see, that would be labeling. Save that for psychotherapy, which is very valuable in its place. This is something else. This is to be able to identify and think as the other does, feel as the other does, rather than using the imagination as a kind of close approximation. This is really to be the other person. So I think these old systems that speak to that issue of how to shift attention into a non-thinking state, where your own thoughts and biases are far in the horizon, they're far in the background, and in the foreground is a set of perceptions and reactions that are non-thinking and are not projected from the self. They're not projected from personal thinking, but a set of reactions that allow us to experience the thoughts, the feelings, the reactions of another person as they really are. It's an extremely humbling experience and very undivided. You can't dislike something when you understand it at that level.
Does a very enlightened human being transcend the 9-point system?
Yes.
Can you get to be a perfect 10? Bad joke.
Very bad joke. The whole predication of the Enneagram, and why I like it, is the idea to transform into the higher states. You see, now the neurosis, for example, in my own case, ego coward, the idea of being secure or safe with other people is very appealing. The idea of the child that went to sleep, the idea of being wide awake and alert and full of energy is a very appealing thing. The idea of somebody who is addicted to producing and promoting a public image, the idea of a real self is very appealing. So in the neurosis, there's like a catalyzing idea, a movement into a higher state, which is a very natural resolution of the fixation of the neurotic problem. And there is a methodology contained within the system to try to get people to move to what's called the higher octave, or the higher part of the self. And that's one of the most powerful parts of the Enneagram, is that it's not locked in this little repeating ego system, where one just exchanges one ego or neurotic structure for another. The idea is to move above it. You see? So the idea of courage is very appealing to me, having been afraid most of my life. So it becomes a way that I can perform practices. I can summon a situation that will make me be afraid. And I can use my attentional and spiritual practices to be able to remove my attention from the fear and the habits that produce that, so that I can act naturally and with courage. You see? So the idea is to summon a situation that makes the neurosis, that inflames the neurosis. You see, you go into the neurosis, you use it as a way of goading yourself. Therefore, you can apply spiritual practices, and they're much more effective in a state like that. It's a heightened state. This was Gurdjieff's idea. You summon the devil. You summon the neurosis. You create situations where you're likely to encounter it. And that's where you perform your attentional practices, so that you can work with the neurosis as an old friend.